Guts and Glory, The American Civil War. I'm going to read this book to you, students, because over the past 3 years that I've been here, I've noticed a lot of kids are really interested in the Civil War. This book is written in a fun and kind of adventurous way, and it describes the events of the Civil War in the chronological order that they happened. So it's a good way to understand the history of the United States during that time period. So here we go. Today we'll begin with the introduction. A quote by Shelby Foote, The Civil War, a narrative. The Civil War defined us as what we are, and it opened us to being what we became, good and bad things. It was the crossroads of our being, and it was a heck of a crossroads. With his teeth clenched and his eyes resolutely fixed on the imposing walls of the Confederate fort looming in front of him, Color Sergeant Alexander Campbell of the 79th New York Volunteer Infantry gripped a heavy 9-foot-tall wooden staff proudly bearing the flag of the United States of America and raced ahead as fast as his legs could carry him, charging through the humid, sun-drenched swamplands of Secessionville, South Carolina, toward the enemy, somehow ignoring the hail of bullets ripping past his head. Campbell bravely led a sea of blue-coated Union soldiers hurtling through the ankle-deep marsh, their rifled muskets brandishing steel bayonets that glinted menacingly in the sunlight. Even as many of his comrades fell around him, Campbell forged ahead. When he reached the wooden walls of the rebel fort, Campbell clambered his way up, slugged a defender with a crushing blow from his staff, and planted the bullet-riddled stars and stripes on the parapet, screaming for his men to follow him. Atop the walls, the Confederate defenders of Secessionville rushed to counter the Union breach, battling the Federal onslaught with everything they had available. One fearsome warrior from the 1st South Carolina Infantry Battalion already had his weapon obliterated by an enemy bullet, but this wasn't about to stop him. He ran up to the parapet, saw a group of Federals charging toward him, and shoved a big log off the ledge, knocking the Yankees back into the swampland below. Suddenly, attacked by another Union trooper at the top of the wall, the now unarmed rebel dodged a bayonet thrust, grabbed his opponent's rifle, ripped it from his hands, and shot him with his own gun. The Confederate soldier's name was James Campbell. He was Union flag bearer, Alexander Campbell's big brother. 2 men, related by blood, fighting a life-or-death struggle on opposite sides of the same battle. How does something like this happen? In the United States, of all places. Countless volumes and entire chapters of boring textbooks have been devoted to describing the causes of the American Civil War of Northern aggression between the states, down to every single nauseating detail, from a day-by-day recreation of bleeding Kansas to a description of the type of underwear Abraham Lincoln was wearing at his presidential inauguration ceremony. The short answer is that the war was fought over slavery, but that doesn't quite cover it. In actuality, the vast majority of Confederate troops fought for the South, even though they never owned a single slave, and many Union soldiers were ultra-passionate about enlisting and fighting for their cause, even though the institution of slavery wasn't formally abolished in the United States until after the war had already been going on for almost 3 years. So what the heck was this all about then? To say the events leading up to the presidential election of 1860 were pretty intense would be like saying that swan diving into an active volcano is kind of a bad idea. Basically, the United States at this time was about as divided as you could get. In the South, wealthy plantation owners utilized millions of black slaves, many of whom were kept under incredibly harsh, unforgivably barbaric conditions, to harvest their tobacco and cotton crops, which were then shipped to the ultra-industrial North for massive profit. The Southern elite were constantly worried that some uppity Yankee politician was going to deprive them of their so-called right to exploit free labor for profit. So they made it their mission to expand slavery into the territory the United States gained after its war with Mexico as a means of protecting their plantations. The industrial northern states, which had already outlawed slavery as cruel and unusual punishment, naturally tried to block this at all costs. The results were intense political tension, a handful of gunfights in border towns, and a whole lot of bad blood between North and South. All this came to a head in the presidential election of 1860, when the ardently anti-slavery Republican candidate, Abraham Lincoln, defeated Democrat Stephen A. Douglas and a couple of other dudes and was elected the 16th president of the United States. Lincoln, who was so hated in the South that he didn't even appear on the ballot in 10 states, swept the northern electoral vote, ultimately receiving 39.8% of the national popular vote and was elected to office. This was the last straw for the South. 7 states seceded from the Union immediately, forming the Confederate States of America. They seized U.S. forts and arsenals, created their own government, and elected Mississippi Senator Jefferson Davis to serve as their president. This move set the United States spiraling into a firestorm that would rip the country in half and lead to the bloodiest war in American history. Lincoln, determined to keep the Union together, put out a call for volunteers to fight and defend America from these dangerous rebels who would dare to break it apart. Union newspapers declared death to the traitors, and all across the North, patriots rallied to the Stars and Stripes, eager to preserve the United States as one country, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Well, this call to arms wasn't heeded as well in some of the southern states, many of which weren't down with fighting a war against their fellow Southerners. As the North prepared for war, 4 more states refused to raise arms for the Union and seceded, their governments putting out a similar request for men to come to the aid of the South. Southerners, many of them poor farmers who never owned slaves themselves, but whose loyalty lay with their home state and not the federal government, flocked to the Confederate banner and prepared to do battle with an army they perceived as an invading force, seeking to unconstitutionally impose its will in the South. The battle lines had been drawn. 21 heavily populated northern industrial states against 11 rural southern states. The Union had the manpower, industry, railroads, and infrastructure to outnumber and outproduce the agrarian South, but they would be fighting on enemy soil against a determined foe. The Confederacy had the advantage of fighting on their home turf against an invading army and had much more experienced generals. They also still held out hope that the great European powers, England and France, both of which depended very heavily on southern cotton exports to keep their economies running, might come to their aid and help them defeat the U.S. forces and preserve their newfound independence. The first shots of the Civil War were fired on April 12, 1861, when South Carolina coastal artillery batteries shelled the Union garrison at Fort Sumter, off the coast of Charleston. The Confederates bombed the fort for about a day and a half before it surrendered, the only fatalities being 2 Union dudes who accidentally blew themselves up after the battle was already over. But everyone got the point, and they were pretty much jumped up after that. It was finally time to stop talking and start fighting. The stage was now set for a war that would pit brother against brother and tear the entire country apart. What happened next would claim more lives than every previous American war combined and redefine the United States of America forever. At this time, the U.S. population was 18.5 million. The Confederate States had 5.5 million, plus 3.5 million slaves. The border was 2.5 million plus 500,000 slaves. Enlistment. In the United States, 2.6 million people. In the Confederate States, only 1 million. Industry. The United States had 101,000 factories, 1.1 million workers, 20,000 miles of railroad, while the Confederate States only had 21,000 factories, 111,000 workers, and 9,000 miles of railroad. On the map, you can see the division between the comparable area of the northern states, which are darker. And you can see up in there, you can see Kansas, Minnesota, Iowa, Wisconsin, Michigan, Illinois, Ohio, Pennsylvania, New York. So those darker states made up the northern union. And then the southern states were the light-colored ones here in this picture. And then if you take a look at the major American conflicts through 1865, so leading up to the Civil War, and you can see by this page how devastating it was. And this is a conflict and death that's being brought upon ourselves, by ourselves, against ourselves. So the American Revolution in 1775 to 1783 against Great Britain, there was an estimated 33,769 deaths. The War of 1812, which lasted from 1812 to 1815 against Great Britain, 6,765 estimated deaths. Second Seminole War, that was against the Seminole Indians from 1835 to 1842. Approximately 1,500 people lost their lives. The Mexican-American War, which was waged against Mexico in a land grab, was 1846 through 1848, with an estimated 17,435 people perishing in that battle. And then here we have the Civil War, 1861 to 1865. 4 years, 1.5 million lives estimated lost. And that was conflict amongst ourselves. So that was the introduction to Guts and Glory, the American Civil War. I'm going to be reading one chapter every day, and I'll be uploading it to the classroom. So if this is something that you're interested in listening to, please do. I hope you're all having a wonderful day. Take care.